I've been experimenting with a bunch of different workflows to try and find the easiest way to paint these beautiful anime background style trees. Let me show you my favorite workflow that I found. We'll go through the whole process from start to finish so that you can give it a try yourself. The brushes and colors that I'm using will all be linked below. This technique starts off in a somewhat unusual way, and you'll see what I mean. I'm beginning with a line to establish where the grass is going to be, and after that I'm starting with the branches and the trunk of the tree. I always like to paint the wood part of the tree first because it gives a structure for where all the foliage is going to be growing out from. It's sort of like the skeleton of the tree. What's unusual about this technique is that I'm using green here instead of brown for the branches. And there is a reason for that. It will become clear when we get into the following step, which is painting the foliage. In the meantime, I'm continuing to fill in the branches. Now this step does not have to be extremely detailed. That would sort of be a waste because a lot of these branches are going to end up getting covered up anyway. This is just a basic structure to help us know where to place our foliage in the next step. We'll be able to add more little branches and smaller details later on in the process. So here we have our structure for the tree ready to go. For this part of the process, I'm using the same paint mix, which is the Holbein Spring Green and a little bit of white. And I'm going to use the structure I created to help me figure out where I can place groupings of foliage. I'll begin by painting these groupings with a kind of circular or dome shape. This helps to give it structure and mass, but it won't stay neat for long. I'm going to add branching shapes poking out. There's kind of a zigzag that you can see forming, or almost like an umbrella opening up. I want to see these zigzags because we need to think about the branches underneath. They don't all stick out perfectly evenly. Some of them are going to reach a little further than others, and it'll give more of a natural and organic look. This is also where you can see an advantage of painting with the green branches. I don't really have to be careful about where I'm painting. It doesn't matter if it blends with the branches below. There isn't going to be any brown paint seeping into the green or anything like that. If I'd have painted the branches brown from the start, then I'd need to use quite a thick layer of green to get full coverage over those branches. And I prefer to use this more luminous, semi-opaque paint mixture when I'm painting foliage. Doing it in this order allows me to do that. You may have noticed that I'm painting somewhat quickly. The reason is I want to be able to add the shadow color while the lighter green is still wet. Here you can see I'm beginning with that using the color Evergreen from the Holbein Summer Gouache set. I'm going to each one of these foliage groupings and adding a shadow on the opposite side of the light source. In this case, the sun is shining from above, so I'm focusing the shadows below and also on the inward-facing side of the groupings. Just remember not to fill in all the space completely if you want to keep a light, airy feeling to your tree. By painting wet and wet here, I was able to get some soft transitions between those greens that I really like, but that is personal preference and it's totally okay if your greens dry in between layers. I think this next part is a lot of fun. We are starting to work smaller, but we're still trying to stay loose. So I'm moving around the tree and adding some scribbly brush strokes to imitate that organic and somewhat chaotic look that we get from leafy foliage. I'm concentrating this detail in the gaps and spaces between the groupings, trying to make sure that I do leave spaces there and I don't close things up completely. I'm also going to add a few more foliage groupings to the bottom of the tree. By painting these completely in shadow, it helps to push that three-dimensional look. I'm also painting the branches in an upside-down V shape to give the impression of weight and gravity. Now let's give some color to the bark of the tree. I'm using Taisha brown, similar to burnt sienna, with a little bit of white and a touch of green. I'm using a transparent mix and painting over the green base color of the tree. The bark will still have a lot of green to it, and that'll become more subtle as we layer, but I really like that bit of green. It's pretty realistic because the bark would have a lot of green bounce light on it in this situation, thanks to the surrounding grass and leaves. Next, I'm using a burnt umber with a touch of green to add some deeper browns to the bark. It's still not extremely dark value-wise. Those deepest shadows will still come later. This step is really more focused on just moving the wood part of the tree over to the right color. Now it's finally time to paint some individual leaf shapes. I'm starting out by echoing that upside down V shape and making these downward angled quick flicking motions with my brush, left and right, to paint the leaves. So flicking from one side to the other, one side to the other. These downward facing leaves on the bottom edge of the tree help to give a feeling of gravity. This is how I like to paint foliage. Simplify it by starting with the big masses, then go in and add these little leaves and textures, especially around the outside edges. It's really interesting how seeing the texture around the silhouette of a shape will trick your brain into understanding that the whole object is made out of that same type of texture, even if we don't show it everywhere. This means that we can leave areas of rest within these larger shapes of foliage. It will still look leafy. We will still understand that the whole tree is made out of leaves. We don't actually have to cover every space on the tree with a tiny little leaf in order for it to feel right, or for it to feel detailed even. Now that I'm moving to the upper half of the tree, I'm switching back to the lighter green color. When I add leaves to the top of the tree, I tend to give them an upward sprouting shape rather than a downward hanging shape. The closer the leaves are to the very top center of the tree, the more I try to direct the leaves upward. And as the branches come down and around the sides toward the bottom, I try to think about the angle of the leaves and pulling them downward to reflect the effects of gravity. I also want to point out right here that I'm leaving a little space between these branches that poke out. It's important to leave some of these gaps. If we fill everything in with leaves, it'll look less natural because we will be losing that feeling of individual branches. That's why I like creating those chunky zigzag shapes in the earlier step, because it really sets us up for this part of the process and keeping that silhouette more natural. Now I've switched to a smaller brush and I'm making some grassy brush strokes at the very base of the tree. I'm starting with a darker green because, of course, this area will be in shadow, but I have my other brush in hand and I'm switching back quickly while the paint is wet and making a nice quick brush stroke right below the darker green and just letting the paint blend together and create a little gradient here. I just felt the need to sneak in a few more little leaves real quick because this one spot caught my eye, but really it is time to move on to the lighter green. So with this step, we are continuing to add leaves around the edges, but this time those edges are within the tree shape. We're going to move around the tree, painting these light green leaves right at the transition points between lighter and darker greens. As with the outside, we don't want to fill in everything perfectly. We want some variation. We want some areas that reach out further than others, so we want to keep that zigzag in mind. Also, since we're now painting light over dark, we need to pay attention to our paint mixture. I'm using the spring green mixed with a little bit of white, which helps to make the paint more opaque. If you aren't getting coverage that you're happy with here, you may need to use less water in your paint mixture. One thing that I like about the current stage of the painting is how bold and clear the lighting is. There are two main values with the light and dark greens, and they still have pretty big and bold shapes at this point. That makes the subject and the lighting situation really easy to read at a glance, and there are advantages to that. If your tree is not the focal point of your illustration or it's further back in the scene, you may find that it works best to stop somewhere around here. That said, for today, my plan is to continue the painting process as if we do want to make a nice detailed tree that will be more central to our painting. So let's add some details up top here. I've mixed a color using the two greens that is darker than the lighter green, but still not as dark as the darker area of the shadows. We don't ever want our darkest details to be within the light areas because we still want them to feel bright. I'm also trying to group leaves in a way that feels natural. I'm trying to avoid evenly spaced individual leaves and instead trying to make little groupings and leave some spaces in between. Here I'm taking some clean water and using that to blend out some edges of the leaf shapes here and there just to give a softer feeling. Let's move on to the shadows. I'm going to focus some attention on those areas where we can see branches deep within the foliage. Because light is passing through green foliage to get to those branches, they will appear more like a deep brownish green rather than a pure brown. That's why using a greener color for this detail will look more natural than a bold brown color, even though in our heads we know the bark to be brown in reality. I'm using a transparent mix for these leaves near the branches and purposely touching the branches with the leaf shape so that it encourages the paint to blend together for a softer transition. It's time to add some darker values to the trunk. I'm using the burnt umber and evergreen to create a color almost between brown and green, and painting this darker value wherever I feel like it would make sense with the sunlight coming down from above. It's important that we keep in mind the lighting situation we decided on at the beginning and make sure that our decisions are consistent with that. So I made a little mistake here. As you can see, it was just a sloppy brush stroke. I didn't mean to go off the trunk there. So I'm just going to turn it into some leaves, maybe some lower branches growing. I'm just going to go with the flow and hopefully make it work. That's the great thing about painting organic subjects is you really can get away with a lot. Of course, if it's really not possible to work something in, you can always just paint over it in order to fix it. But I think it's actually kind of cool how this turned out. Maybe it was more of a happy accident than anything because it added a little more lushness to the tree. So as I continue on with the painting, I'm asking myself, where does it make sense to add more detail and polish to the tree? I feel like a natural focal point has already been developing right in this area where I'm working right now, where the branches are separating away from the trunk. There's already more detail focused in that area. It's at the center of the tree, and there's a lot of contrast with the darkest and lightest greens coming together in that spot. I'm speeding things up here for the next little bit, but I'm just going to continue working on that focal area. My goal is to add some more leaves, more details. This part of the process can take a little bit of patience, but I generally enjoy the detailing. I find it kind of therapeutic, and it's fun because you get to see things start to become more beautiful. Along with adding details, this is also a good time to fix any mistakes you might notice, anything catching your eye. For example, if there's an area that's too bright or too dark or just like a weird shaped mark or something like that, this is a good time to clean those things up. I find that sometimes the hardest thing for me is knowing when to stop with this step. It can be really, really easy to overdo it. I like when some parts of the painting are left a little bit more loose. I think it makes it feel more lively and expressive, and that's something that I'm really trying to preserve. The painting is nearly done, and in fact, most of the time I think I'd end it here, but for the sake of giving you as many tools as I can, there's one last highlighting step I sometimes do, so I'm going to show that to you now. I'm using a small round brush and kind of trying to squeeze off the excess paint from my brush. I'm using white with just a touch of green to it. And I don't want the paint to be too goopy on my brush because I'm trying to make these sharp little brush strokes. For the most part, the shapes that I'm making are somewhat flat. The idea is we're seeing leaves reflecting light from above, and the leaves are facing upward. We're seeing them at kind of a foreshortened angle. So we're just getting these thin little highlights, and I'm trying to angle them how I feel like the leaves would naturally be sitting. So they're somewhat horizontal, but you can see here the way I'm arranging them. That brings us to the end of this tree painting process. I really hope you enjoyed it. If you liked the video, please consider giving it a like and subscribe if you want to see more videos like this. Comment below if you have any suggestions or ideas for future topics you'd like to see me paint. Thank you so much for watching and see you next time. Bye!